Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a quiet little stroll into one of those odd corners of history. So, dim the lights, settle into your pillow, maybe let the rain tap on your window if you're lucky enough to have it. And let's talk about minstrels and jesters. Now, when I say minstrels and jesters, most people immediately picture the medieval fool in a floppy hat with bells, tumbling around a royal hall while kings roar with laughter. Or maybe a lute player wandering around serenading star-crossed lovers. But, as always, the reality is weirder, sadder, and sometimes just a bit gross. Because these weren't just entertainers. They were disposable political tools, gossip spreaders, and sometimes professional survivors in a world that didn't care much if they lived or died. So, let's start drifting through the world of these oddly precarious medieval performers. A life on the road. The minstrel, first of all, wasn't some glamorous rock star of the Middle Ages. He was more like that friend who insists on bringing a guitar to every party, except instead of being annoying, it was his entire job. Minstrels traveled from castle to castle, town to town, sometimes even tagging along with armies, playing music, telling stories, and reciting ballads. On paper, this sounds kind of romantic, right? Singing under the stars, traveling Europe, basking in applause. But in reality, it was a terrible career choice unless you enjoyed being broke, hungry, and occasionally beaten for spreading the wrong rumor. Because here's the thing, minstrels weren't just about music. They were also walking medieval news outlets. They told tales of battles, kings, scandals, and, in many cases, they were the medieval equivalent of tabloids. And we all know how much kings and queens love being talked about in public. Not at all. So, if your ballad painted the queen as noble and radiant, you might get a coin or two. If it accidentally hinted that the duke was a little too fond of his wine, you might get thrown in a ditch. It was, shall we say, an unstable employment situation, the jester's delicate balancing act. Then, of course, there was the jester, the fool, the guy in the silly costume whose job was to insult kings and, somehow, not die immediately afterward. Which already tells you how much of a tightrope walk this was. A good jester had to be witty enough to amuse a monarch, but not too witty, sarcastic enough to entertain, but not insulting enough to spark treason charges. And above all, they had to make the royal court laugh without accidentally revealing the truth everyone was quietly ignoring. Which is to say, they were basically medieval stand-up comedians performing exclusively for an audience that could execute them on a whim. And yes, jesters could be executed for bad jokes, or, more often, just quietly retired in ways we don't need to imagine too graphically tonight. The fool as truth-teller. But here's the funny part. The fool wasn't just comic relief. He often had more political power than many lords did. Because in a court where everyone was terrified to tell the king the truth, the fool could slip in little sarcastic jabs that no one else dared to say out loud. Picture it. A council of grim-faced knights and advisors, all too scared to admit that the king's new tax plan was a disaster. And then, in waddles the jester, jingling away, and blurts out something like, "Oh, my lord, I see you've found yet another way to make the peasants hate you. How clever cue nervous laughter. Everyone shifts uncomfortably. The king, depending on his mood, either laughs or throws a goblet. But sometimes that little jab was the only way real criticism ever reached the royal brain, which means that the jester, ridiculous as he looked, was often the closest thing to honesty in the entire medieval court. Of course, that honesty came with a ticking clock. You could only push your luck so far before even the best joke turned sour. When the fun died down, and this is where the dangerous part really comes in, because while minstrels and jesters filled their days with songs, jokes, and clever wordplay, their lives were brutally precarious. For minstrels, if you weren't sponsored by a noble household, you were basically homeless. Roaming the roads in medieval Europe was not exactly safe. There were bandits, disease, starvation, and most towns treated wandering performers with suspicion, like potential thieves or spies. And for jesters, well, your fate was chained to your master. If the king died or simply got tired of your act, you might find yourself unemployed. And unemployed fool wasn't exactly a hot career path. There are stories of jesters ending their days as beggars, rotting away in poorhouses, or occasionally being kept around as a sort of pathetic old pet for the court. Imagine devoting your whole life to juggling insults and jokes, only to end up sitting in a corner while everyone ignores you. Tragic in a grimly comic way. Humor in hardship. And yet, there's something oddly human here, because despite the danger, despite the humiliations, despite the constant risk of being laughed at for the wrong reason, people still became minstrels and jesters. Some out of desperation, some out of talent, some maybe just because they liked the sound of bells on a hat. They carved out a place for themselves in a society that didn't exactly reward creativity. And in doing so, they became these strange little footnotes in history, reminders that even in the middle of plague, war, and dynastic backstabbing, people still wanted to laugh. Let's float a little deeper into their world. Next, we'll drift into the bizarre things these performers actually did to keep their patrons amused. Because, spoiler, it wasn't all music and knock-knock jokes. So, we've set the stage. Minstrels wandering the roads, jesters carefully insulting kings, both living on the edge of society. But what exactly did these people do all day? It wasn't just singing, juggling, or telling a quick joke. Oh no. The job description was, let's say, flexible. More than just music for minstrels, performance was a whole package deal. You didn't just strum a lute and call it a night. You had to weave together ballads, recite poems, tell stories, and occasionally act out little plays. If you could juggle or perform acrobatics, even better. But let's be honest, medieval audiences weren't exactly polite. Imagine trying to sing your heart out in a smoky hall filled with drunk knights, slamming their mugs and yelling requests. And if you messed up, well, you might not get paid. Or worse, you might get paid in the form of a half-eaten chicken leg tossed at your head. And of course, the songs themselves could be dangerous. A misplaced lyric could sound like an insult. A joke about a noble's bald spot might cost you your teeth. So, every word had to be carefully chosen, every gesture calculated. It's a bit like being a modern YouTuber, really. Say the wrong thing, and suddenly your whole audience turns on you. Only difference? In the Middle Ages, the comment section could literally kill you. The jester's expanding resume. As for jesters, well, they were basically the Swiss Army knife of entertainment. Yes, they joked. Yes, they wore bells. But they were also acrobats, dancers, singers, jugglers, animal trainers, and in some cases, human props. One jester might be forced to leap over tables and chairs for laughs. Another might be asked to mockingly imitate the king's enemies. And some poor fools had to do humiliating stunts like pretending to be a horse, neighing and galloping around the hall, while knights laughed into their ale. Imagine dedicating your life to witty satire, only to be told, "Great joke, now crawl on all fours and let the Duchess ride on your back." Yes, that happened, and it was considered hilarious, the emotional punching bag. But jesters weren't just there for comedy. They were often used as emotional release valves for stressed-out royals. Kings and queens, constantly under political pressure, couldn't lash out at their nobles. So, they lashed out at the fool. There are plenty of records of jesters being slapped, kicked, or even whipped for laughs. The crowd would chuckle. The king would feel better. The fool would, well, hopefully recover. And yet, bizarrely, many jesters accepted this role, because while the job was humiliating, it also kept them close to power. And being close to power, even as a target of abuse, was still safer than starving on the streets. When pets and people blurred, some courts even blurred the line between jester and pet. A noble might treat their fool like a talking dog, parading them around, showing them off to guests, and demanding tricks at random. There are even accounts of fools being dressed up in animal skins, forced to eat scraps, or locked in kennels for comedic effect. It sounds cruel, and it was, but in the twisted logic of the medieval court, this was entertainment. And yet, strangely, some jesters managed to spin this into influence. They leaned into the role of pet or plaything, and used it as cover to say things no one else dared to say. If the fool was already ridiculous, then he could get away with being honest. A humiliating mask, but also a shield. Strange skills and stunts. Of course, not all the tricks were degrading. Some were downright bizarre. Jesters were expected to do things like recite long poems backwards, balance knives or flaming torches, train animals, monkeys, dogs, or even geese, to perform routines. Stage little improvised plays where they mocked courtiers to their faces. One fool in the court of Henry VIII became famous for imitating the king's temper tantrums, stomping around and throwing cups, just like his master. Henry, famously thin-skinned, should have executed him instantly, but apparently he found it funny. Lucky fool. Another jester in France was so skilled at physical comedy that nobles described him as half monkey, half man, which, depending on your perspective, was either a compliment or a reason to seek new employment. The perils of overstepping. But again, all of this came with risk. A fool could ride high in favor one day, only to tumble spectacularly the next. One wrong joke, one unlucky gesture, and you were done. There's a story of a jester who mocked his king's military losses a little too sharply. The king laughed in the moment, then had him executed the next morning. It was the medieval equivalent of laughing at a meme, then reporting the account. This was the central danger of the fool's life. Your whole existence depended on the mood swings of powerful, unstable people. And in medieval Europe, unstable monarch was practically a job requirement, the shadow of the future. And here's the interesting twist. As the Middle Ages shifted into the Renaissance, minstrels began to fade. They were replaced by more formal court musicians and playwrights. The wandering ballad singer became less important as printing presses spread stories faster than any song could. But fools, they lingered. Every court, it seemed, still needed that one ridiculous figure to laugh at. They lasted well into the 16th and even 17th centuries, a lingering relic of a medieval world that just couldn't let go of its favorite punchline. So, we've seen their tricks, their humiliations, and the strange ways they survived. But let's drift even further into the real lives of famous historical fools, because yes, some of them had names, personalities, and surprisingly influential roles. So far, we've looked at minstrels roaming the roads and jesters tumbling through humiliations. But history does remember a few of these figures by name, and against all odds, some of them managed to become more than just walking punch lines. They became confidants, advisors, and, in a few cases, the most trusted people in a royal court. Because if you think about it, who better to hear a king's secrets than the one person he wasn't afraid of? Will Sommers, the fool who outlived Henry VIII. Let's start with the most famous English fool, Will Sommers, the court jester of Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII wasn't exactly known for his sense of humor. He was more famous for chopping off wives' heads and eating himself into immobility. Not the kind of guy you'd want to tease about his waistline, and yet Will Sommers somehow managed to survive decades at Henry's side. He was there through multiple marriages, through the break with Rome, through the endless tantrums. And while nobles came and went, often by way of executioner, the fool stayed. Sommers wasn't just a clown. He had a sharp tongue, and he knew exactly how far he could push Henry. Records describe him as making jests that no one else dared, which is historians speak for he roasted the king to his face and didn't die. A rare skill. When Henry grew sickly and paranoid toward the end of his life, Will Sommers was still there. Some sources even suggest he was the only person who could cheer the king up in his final miserable years. And in a way, that gave the fool more emotional power than almost anyone else at court. Of course, once Henry died, Sommers quietly faded. He lingered under the next monarchs for a while, but the glory days were gone. It's a perfect example of how tied the fool's life was to the whims of a single person. Triboulet, the sharp-tongued French fool. Across the Channel, France had its own legendary jester, Triboulet, who served King Francis I. Triboulet was famous for being brutally honest, too honest. His jokes were biting, his satire harsh, and he often crossed lines that no one else would dare to even approach. There's a story, probably exaggerated, but delightful anyway, where Triboulet insulted a nobleman so viciously that the man demanded he be executed. The king, fond of his fool, supposedly compromised by saying, "Very well, Triboulet must die, but since he is clever, I will allow him to choose the manner of his death." Triboulet, never missing a beat, replied, "Then, sire, I choose to die of old age." The king laughed and spared him, which is basically the Renaissance version of getting out of trouble with a really good punchline. But, like most jesters, Triboulet wasn't immortal. He eventually pushed one joke too far, and while details are fuzzy, it seems he may have been banished or quietly erased from court. Even the sharpest wit has an expiration date. Archie Armstrong, Scotland's mischief maker. Now, if we drift up to Scotland, we find Archie Armstrong, fool to King James VI, who later became James I of England. Archie was less of a clown and more of a sarcastic court gossip. He had a knack for needling ambassadors and lords, slipping in barbs that the king himself couldn't say out loud, which made him useful and dangerous. He basically became the king's unofficial roastmaster. But Archie also discovered the universal law of jesterdom. Push too far, and you're toast. He insulted a powerful churchman one time too many, and suddenly the king's patience ran out. Archie was stripped of his position and sent packing. He did, however, retire comfortably on the money he'd made at court, which, compared to most fools, is basically a fairy tale ending. Jane the Fool, a rare female jester. And yes, there were women in this world too. One of the few recorded female jesters in English history was simply known as Jane the Fool, who served Queen Catherine Parr and later Princess Mary Tudor. Jane's life is less documented, but we know she was more than just a clown. She was a companion, a kind of emotional support figure for the women she served, which tells us something interesting. Female fools may have had a different role, more about intimacy and comfort than pure mockery. It's a reminder that not every fool's life was bells and juggling. Some were closer to confidants or even therapists, though, of course, no one in Tudor England would have called them that. When fools became symbols. What's striking about all these stories is how fools often became symbols of honesty. In a world where everyone else was terrified of speaking truth to power, the fool had a license to say the unsayable. And rulers, for all their paranoia, often valued this. Maybe they needed someone to puncture their egos once in a while. Maybe they just liked the novelty. But in many cases, the jester was the only person in the room who could cut through the nonsense. Of course, the job still came with humiliation, abuse, and danger. But if you were skilled, really skilled, you could carve out a strange kind of safety. You could be the one voice the king actually listened to. So, we've met some of the names and personalities behind the floppy hats. In Part 4, let's drift into the decline of the minstrel and fool, and how these odd characters slowly faded as Europe moved into the modern age. So, we've wandered through the smoky great halls. We've seen minstrels juggling for coins and fools whispering truths into royal ears. But nothing in history lasts forever. And as Europe crept out of the Middle Ages and into something resembling the modern world, both minstrels and jesters started to look, well, outdated. The minstrel's last song for minstrels, the decline came early. By the late 15th century, the printing press was spreading stories, songs, and news much faster than any wandering ballad singer ever could. Why pay a minstrel to stumble through your town and mumble half a saga when you could just buy a cheap printed pamphlet? And of course, as literacy rose, people started reading their entertainment instead of listening to it. The wandering singer became less essential, more of a relic. Some minstrels clung to noble households, morphing into more polished court musicians. Others just faded into the general haze of traveling performers, competing with acrobats, puppeteers, and eventually theater troupes. By the 17th century, the word minstrel was already old-fashioned. The romantic image of the wandering bard would live on, but mostly in nostalgia and poetry, not in real life. The fool who stayed too long. Jesters, though, stuck around longer. Courts across Europe clung to them well into the Renaissance. There was just something irresistible about having a fool on hand, a human stress ball for kings and queens. But over time, even fools started to feel awkward. By the 1600s, royal courts were becoming more formal, more polished, more obsessed with dignity. And dignity, unfortunately, doesn't pair well with a grown man wearing bells on his head. Monarchs wanted playwrights, poets, and composers, not someone juggling in the corner. They wanted grand masks and performances that reflected their glory, not a jester mocking their double chins. So fools began to vanish. Some were quietly pensioned off. Others were replaced by actors and comedians who could be funny without being humiliating. The birth of theater and comedy. In a way, the decline of the jester gave birth to something new, As fools disappeared from court, theaters sprang up. Shakespeare, Molière, and other playwrights filled the void with comic characters who were safe to laugh at. And those comic characters often were fools, at least in spirit. The wise fool became a staple of theater, a character who seemed ridiculous, but spoke the deepest truths. Think of Shakespeare's fools, who often steal the show with their cleverness. They were the literary descendants of the real jesters, polished up for a paying audience instead of a moody monarch. So, while the floppy hats disappeared, the archetype lived on. The afterlife of the fool. Interestingly, some rulers missed their fools long after the tradition faded. Peter the Great of Russia tried to revive the role in the 18th century, surrounding himself with a group of comic advisors. It didn't really stick. By then, the image of a fool had become too old-fashioned, but echoes remained. Even in the 19th century, some noble households kept family jesters, often elderly servants who amused children or lightened the mood at gatherings. They weren't political anymore, just nostalgic decorations. And today, well, you could argue the spirit of the jester lives on in comedians, satirists, and late-night talk show hosts. They're the ones mocking leaders to their faces, sometimes telling truths no one else will say. The stakes are lower, usually no executions, but the role is strangely familiar. Why they mattered. It's tempting to laugh at these figures, to dismiss them as silly side characters, but minstrels and fools actually tell us something deeper about medieval life. They show us that even in a world full of plague, war, and endless dynastic crises, people still craved entertainment. They wanted stories. They wanted laughter. And maybe most importantly, rulers needed them too. Kings and queens, buried under the weight of power, still turned to a fool in bells for comfort. That's oddly human, isn't it? In a sense, jesters were more than clowns. They were the safety valve for entire kingdoms. They took the humiliation, the jokes, the slaps, so that power could breathe a little easier. And in doing so, they carved out one of the strangest, most precarious niches in history. The quiet end. So the story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. No great revolt of fools, no dramatic final performance. They just faded. The bells grew quiet. The song stopped echoing through the halls. And the world moved on, as it always does. But if you listen closely, maybe you can still hear it. A faint jingle of bells in the background of history. A reminder that sometimes the most fragile voices, the singers, the clowns, the jesters, are the ones that linger longest in our imagination. And with that, we'll let the minstrels and fools rest. Their lives were dangerous, ridiculous, and often humiliating, but also strangely essential, because without them, medieval history would be a lot quieter, and probably a lot sadder. So, what did a day actually look like for these people? It's one thing to imagine the grand performances in front of kings, queens, and knights, but most of their hours were not spent juggling in candlelit halls. They had lives in between the jokes, and most of it was, well, not glamorous. Waking up in the margins. For a wandering minstrel, mornings probably started on the road, sleeping in barns, inns if they were lucky, or under hedges if they weren't. Minstrels didn't exactly earn steady wages. Payment could be a coin, a meal, or just thanks, now get lost. So, before they could perform, they had to scrounge, find breakfast, beg a little, tune their instruments, which, by the way, weren't exactly reliable. Lutes and fiddles made from medieval materials went out of tune constantly. Imagine trying to sing a heartfelt ballad while half your strings are buzzing like angry bees. Then came the real work, wandering into a village or castle and convincing people to let you perform. There wasn't always an eager audience waiting. Sometimes you had to chase people down with the promise of a song. Sometimes you had to flatter the local lord's ego until he handed you a coin. It was part music, part salesmanship, part survival. The jester's breakfast bell. For jesters attached to a noble household, mornings were different. You didn't wake up under a hedge, but you also didn't exactly rise in luxury. You were property of the household, and your job could begin the moment someone in charge felt cranky. Picture this. It's dawn. The cook hasn't even finished the morning porridge, and suddenly the noble shouts for his fool. Why? Because he had a bad dream, and he wants a laugh. So you drag yourself out of bed, bells jingling, and perform half asleep just to keep your position secure. In some courts, fools even ate separately from the rest of the household staff, a reminder that, despite their closeness to power, they weren't truly part of the hierarchy. They were somewhere between servant and pet. The performances that weren't fun. Not every performance was music or jokes. Sometimes nobles demanded cruel stunts. Records mention fools being forced to eat unpleasant things, raw onions by the handful, or food deliberately spiced until it was inedible. The court would laugh as the fool gagged and sputtered. Other times, jesters were pushed into fights, not serious combat, but slapstick brawls with other servants, staged purely for amusement. You might be ordered to wrestle, tumble, or get knocked into barrels. The medieval equivalent of jackass, except you couldn't refuse. It wasn't all witty barbs and Shakespearean wisdom. Much of it was slapstick, humiliation, and pain. Gossip as currency. Both minstrels and fools also had another job, carrying gossip. Minstrels spread rumors between towns. They were walking medieval news feeds, singing ballads about scandals, battles, and affairs. Of course, the stories were often exaggerated or completely fabricated. But that was half the fun. Accuracy wasn't the point. Entertainment was. Jesters, meanwhile, thrived on court gossip. They were close enough to overhear secrets, yet ridiculous enough that no one took them seriously. A perfect cover. Some fools quietly built power this way, whispering rumors into the king's ear, making themselves valuable as informal spies. It's ironic. The people dressed as clowns often knew more about court politics than the most serious lords in their fur robes. The rare privileges. Despite the danger and humiliation, fools did sometimes enjoy privileges. A good fool might eat at the king's table, travel with the court, and live better than most peasants ever dreamed. They could even mock high-ranking nobles without getting executed on the spot, something no one else dared to try. There are even stories of jesters being given lands, pensions, or special gifts. One English fool was granted a country estate after years of service. Another had free access to the royal stables, a perk most knights would envy. So, while the fool's life was dangerous, it could also be weirdly rewarding. If you could survive the insults, you might end up with a level of security unheard of for a commoner. Minstrel competitions. Minstrels, too, sometimes had moments of glory. Certain towns hosted contests where traveling performers competed. The best singer might walk away with a prize purse, or at least bragging rights. But of course, these competitions could be cutthroat. Accusations of cheating, stolen ballads, or tampered instruments weren't uncommon. Imagine Eurovision, but with lice, dysentery, and the occasional sword fight. Living in the in-between. What's striking about both groups is how they lived in a strange in-between world. Minstrels weren't quite peasants, but they weren't noble either. Jesters were inside the court, but not respected like courtiers. They existed in liminal space, useful, visible, but never fully belonging. And maybe that's why they fascinated people then, and why they fascinate us now. They were human mirrors, reflecting the society around them, while never really fitting into it. So, now we've peeked into their daily lives, the good, the bad, and the humiliating. In Part 6, let's float even deeper into the psychology of the fool, why rulers kept them, how they shaped royal behavior, and why being laughed at could sometimes be a form of survival. So far, we've looked at the fool as an entertainer, a clown, even a punching bag. But let's be honest, monarchs didn't keep jesters around just for laughs. They had plenty of diversions, hunts, tournaments, banquets, masks. They could have hired poets, musicians, or actors instead. Yet almost every medieval and Renaissance court had at least one fool jingling around, which means the fool served a deeper purpose, the king's pressure valve. Being a medieval monarch wasn't all feasts and crowns. It was stress, endless stress, wars to fight, nobles to bribe, taxes to squeeze out of miserable peasants, heirs to produce, enemies to plot against, and, of course, the constant fear of being poisoned by your own dinner. In that environment, kings and queens needed someone who could break the tension, someone who could make them laugh when their entire existence was wrapped in paranoia. Enter the fool. The jester became a kind of pressure valve. He absorbed the monarch's anger, diffused tension with jokes, and created moments of levity in otherwise grim lives. You could argue he was less an entertainer and more a medieval therapist, just dressed in bells instead of a white coat. Honesty in a world of lies. Another reason fools mattered, honesty. Royal courts were thick with lies. Nobles flattered the king, bishops nodded along, courtiers agreed with every whim. No one dared to say the truth because truth could get your head cut off. But the fool, he could. His whole role was to mock and tease. Wrapped in the costume of comedy, he could slip in real criticism. A sarcastic line about a disastrous policy, a joke about the queen's overspending, a barb about the king's temper. It might sting, but it also made the monarch pause, and sometimes that tiny jab of honesty was more useful than an entire council of sycophants. In this way, the fool acted as a bizarre sort of conscience, ridiculous, humiliating, but also necessary. The childlike comfort. There's also something childlike about the fool. His silly clothes, his pranks, his antics, all of it reminded rulers of childhood. And for monarchs constantly performing the role of supreme authority, that comfort mattered. Some records suggest that fools weren't just performers, but also companions, people the monarch could let their guard down around. Henry VIII, for example, trusted Will Somers in ways he didn't trust powerful nobles, because Somers wasn't a threat. He was just a fool. It's ironic, but the clown was sometimes the safest person in the room, the shadow of cruelty. Of course, there was a darker side. The same qualities that made fools comforting also made them targets. Their vulnerability invited cruelty. Kings could slap, kick, or humiliate their fools precisely because they were safe. In a sense, fools embodied the tension of medieval power, both indispensable and disposable, cherished and abused. One day a confidant, the next day a victim of royal boredom. Fools as reflections. But here's where it gets interesting. Fools often mirrored their masters. Their jokes reflected the insecurities of the ruler. Their antics exaggerated the monarch's flaws. They were like walking caricatures, holding up an unflattering mirror. And rulers, at least the more self-aware ones, seemed to value that. It was a reminder that even kings could be ridiculous. Maybe it was humbling. Maybe it was just funny. But either way, it gave the fool a strangely important role in shaping royal self-image. Minstrels in this picture. And what about minstrels? Their psychology was different, but still revealing. Minstrels provided a sense of connection to the wider world. They carried stories, news, and gossip. For nobles stuck in isolated castles, that mattered. Minstrels reminded rulers of their reputations. A song could glorify a victory or quietly hint at a scandal. In that way, they too acted as mirrors, not of personality, but of public image. So while fools reflected the king's inner life, minstrels reflected his outer one, both dangerous, both fragile, both necessary. The strange bond. What's most striking is how intimate these relationships could be. Monarchs might trust a fool more than their own family. A minstrel's ballad might matter more than a bishop's sermon. These were not powerful men, not influential nobles, but their words carried weight, precisely because they weren't taken seriously. It's almost paradoxical. By being ridiculous, they became safe, and by being safe, they became truthful. And that truth, however softly delivered, was priceless in a world built on lies and ceremony. So now we understand why rulers needed fools and minstrels. But what happened when the fool became too powerful? In Part 7, we'll float into stories of jesters who pushed their influence a little too far. And what happened when the joke stopped being funny? For every fool who thrived by balancing wit and humility, there were others who pushed their luck. Some fools mistook laughter for invincibility. Others couldn't resist a perfect insult, even when it put their heads on the line. And history, being what it is, remembers a few spectacular flameouts. The fool who mocked the wrong war. One famous story comes from the court of an English king. Historians argue about which one, but the details remain juicy. A fool, emboldened by years of royal indulgence, made a biting joke about a recent military defeat. The king laughed in the moment, because that's what everyone else did. But laughter didn't always mean forgiveness. The next morning, the fool was quietly dragged out and executed. Lesson learned. Medieval monarchs might laugh at your joke, but they still had the final punchline. Archie Armstrong's fatal insult. We already met Archie Armstrong, the Scottish fool who thrived under King James VI. For years, Archie poked fun at ambassadors, cardinals, and nobles. He seemed untouchable. But then he insulted a powerful bishop, not just a little jab, a full-blown public roast. The churchmen complained, and this time the king sided with the bishop. Archie was stripped of his title and sent packing. He survived, even retired with some wealth, but his fall was dramatic. One day, the king's favorite jester. The next, an outcast. Tribulet's vanishing act. France's legendary fool Triboulet also had a habit of going too far. His sharp wit delighted King Francis I, but it didn't always land with everyone else. Nobles despised him. Enemies plotted against him. At some point, Triboulet pushed one insult too many. The details are murky. Some say he was banished, others that he was quietly removed from court life. Either way, his razor-sharp tongue eventually cut too deep. The lesson? You could make fun of kings all day, but mock the wrong noble, and suddenly your protection evaporated. The fool who spilled secrets. One of the more dangerous mistakes a fool could make was gossip. Remember? Jesters overheard everything. They had access to royal bedrooms, council chambers, and private dinners. Most fools knew to keep their mouths shut, but a few let secrets slip, turning private affairs into punchlines, and that, more than anything else, was unforgivable. There are records of fools being whipped, imprisoned, or worse for revealing too much. In a world where politics was life and death, a careless jest could start a rebellion. When kings got tired of the joke, sometimes fools didn't even need to cross a line. They just wore out their welcome. Humor ages quickly, and what once made a monarch laugh could later seem stale or irritating. One chronicler describes a king dismissing his fool simply because he was no longer merry. No scandal, no insult, no betrayal, just boredom. That was the cruelest fate of all, to be forgotten, discarded like a broken toy, not executed, not banished, just irrelevant. Why they risked it. But here's the twist. Fools kept pushing anyway. They took risks because the reward was enormous. A sharp joke could win favor, secure gifts, even sway policy. Some fools wielded more influence with a single quip than entire councils did with hours of debate. And once you've tasted that kind of power, it's hard to pull back. So they gambled, and sometimes they won big, and sometimes they lost everything. The thin line. All of this highlights the impossible tightrope fools walked. They had to be funny, but not too funny. Honest, but not too honest. Close to power, but never appearing ambitious. Cross the line, and you were gone. Stay on it, and you might live better than most commoners ever dreamed. It was a dangerous game, but then again, that was the job. So, we've seen fools fall from grace. In Part 8, let's flip the coin and look at the times fools actually shaped history, when their jokes and songs didn't just entertain, but influenced kings, policies, and even wars. Most of the time, jesters and minstrels were background noise, human wallpaper in the grand drama of kings and queens. But every so often, their words and songs tipped the balance of power. And when that happened, the world got a reminder. Never underestimate the person in motley or the guy with a lute. The fool who saved a life. One of the clearest examples comes from Will Somers, Henry VIII's fool. According to stories, Somers once interceded for a courtier who had fallen out of favor. Henry was in one of his off-with-their-head moods, and no one dared to beg for mercy, except the fool. Somers made a joke about how executions were costing the crown too much money, then slyly suggested sparing the man. Somehow it worked. The courtier's life was saved because the fool had the courage and the wit to say what no one else could. In a sense, Somers acted as both jester and diplomat. He turned a joke into a pardon. Tribolet's political barbs. In France, Tribolet did more than make Francis I laugh. He sometimes used his jokes to influence royal policy. Chroniclers note that he mocked certain nobles so mercilessly that the king began to distrust them. Think about that. A noble might spend years building political clout, only for a fool's one-liner to erode it in a single evening. Tribolet's humor shaped reputations, which in turn shaped court politics. His mockery could shift alliances and tip balances of power. Of course, that kind of influence was dangerous, and it probably explains why so many nobles hated him. Minstrels as propaganda machines. While jesters shaped the private world of kings, minstrels had the power to shape public opinion. Medieval rulers understood that songs could travel farther than armies. A single ballad could glorify a victory, spread a heroic myth, or bury a scandal under layers of flattering exaggeration. Some kings even paid minstrels specifically to write propaganda. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, Norman minstrels sang of William the Conqueror's bravery and Harold's cowardice. Did ordinary peasants know what really happened? Probably not. But they heard the song, and the song became the truth. In this way, minstrels were like the medieval press corps, but set to music. The fool as court critic. Sometimes fools could shape policy more directly. A clever fool might highlight the absurdity of a new tax or joke about a failed law. And because it was framed as humor, the monarch might actually listen instead of punishing the criticism. There are scattered stories of kings abandoning bad ideas after their fool ridiculed them. It wasn't common, but it happened. In a roundabout way, jesters acted as the kingdom's last line of quality control. Jane, the fool's quiet influence. Female fools, rare as they were, may have had even subtler power. Jane, the fool, who served Queen Mary I, was less about mockery and more about companionship. She could soothe the queen's moods, distract her from paranoia, and perhaps even temper her harsher instincts. In a way, Jane's influence was emotional rather than political. But when you're dealing with a monarch whose moods could decide life or death for thousands, emotional influence was political. A song that sparked rebellion. There are also darker stories. In some cases, minstrel songs helped spark rebellion. Take the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Among the causes was widespread resentment over taxes and corruption. But the revolt was also fueled by ballads and rhymes mocking the government. Minstrels and poets spread these biting verses, and people sang them in taverns, markets, and fields. It wasn't a fool in a court this time. It was a chorus of voices on the road. But the principle was the same. Entertainment had teeth. Why this mattered. All of this reminds us that jesters and minstrels weren't just clowns on the sidelines. They were cultural influencers before the word existed. They shaped perception, swayed monarchs, and occasionally redirected history with nothing more than a joke or a song. And that's what makes them fascinating. Power didn't always flow through crowns or swords. Sometimes it jingled in bells or strummed through a lute. So we've seen the heights of influence fools and minstrels could reach. In Part 9, let's explore the dark humor of death, how fools and minstrels handled executions, funerals, and tragedy, often turning grim moments into bizarre comedy. The Middle Ages were soaked in death, plagues, famines, wars, executions. Life was fragile, and reminders of mortality were never far away. For jesters and minstrels, that wasn't just background noise. It was their material. They had to perform in a world where tragedy was constant, and sometimes the only way to survive it, literally and emotionally, was to laugh at it. Performing at executions. Believe it or not, jesters sometimes appeared at executions. A king might bring his fool along to lighten the mood, turning a public death into a twisted kind of theater. In one chronicled case, a fool cracked jokes while a nobleman was beheaded, quipping about how the man had lost his head over politics. The crowd roared with laughter, not because it was genuinely funny, but because humor dulled the horror. It's chilling, but that was the fool's role, to make the unbearable bearable, even when blood was literally on the stage. The minstrels' ballads of death minstrels, meanwhile, sang about death constantly. Heroes slain in battle, kings betrayed, lovers lost to plague. Medieval ballads rarely had happy endings, because real life rarely did. But even in these grim songs there was often a streak of irony or black humor, a knight boasting of invincibility only to die from a kitchen accident, a proud lord mocked in rhyme after being felled by something as mundane as indigestion. These songs gave audiences permission to laugh at fate, even when fate was cruel. Jokes about the plague, the Black Death wiped out nearly half of Europe, and yet fools still found ways to joke about it. Some quips were brutally simple. At least fleas don't pay taxes. Others mocked physicians who were seen as useless against the disease. Humor became a shield. When everyone was terrified of coughing neighbors and swelling buboes, a fool's irreverence could puncture the fear, if only for a moment. It wasn't just comedy, it was survival. Laughing at their own deaths. Sometimes jesters even joked about their own mortality. A famous example comes from Triboulet. After offending one too many nobles, he was sentenced to death. But King Francis I, who still liked him, offered him a choice. He could pick how he wanted to die. Triboulet thought for a moment, then replied, "By old age, your majesty." The king laughed so hard that he spared him. Humor literally saved his life. Gallows humor in court. This kind of humor became so common it has a name we still use, gallows humor. The idea that when staring death in the face, the best response is a joke. For medieval fools and minstrels, gallows humor wasn't a quirky trait. It was their entire existence. They lived at the edge of danger every day. A bad performance, a misplaced word, or just a foul-tempered king could mean the end. So they joked about death constantly, because by laughing at it, they robbed it of some of its power. Why this mattered. This tells us something important about the medieval mindset. Laughter wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of coping with horror, a way of asserting humanity in a world that was often brutal and unforgiving. And in that sense, fools and minstrels were more than performers. They were guides, showing people how to survive tragedy without losing their sanity. By laughing at death, they reminded everyone that life, however short, could still be lived with defiance. So, that's the dark humor of death. In Part 10, let's wander into something a little different. The strange tricks, stunts, and bizarre talents fools and minstrels used to keep audiences hooked, from juggling animals to swallowing knives. When you think of a medieval jester, you probably pictured juggling, pratfalls, maybe a silly song, but the truth is, these performers had to constantly innovate. If you did the same trick twice, the audience got bored, and boredom in court could be deadly. So fools and minstrels developed a wide arsenal of strange skills. Some were impressive, some were humiliating, some were just plain disturbing. The human circus, a skilled fool wasn't just a comedian. He was a one-man circus. He might juggle knives or flaming torches, walk on his hands across the banquet hall, balance a goblet on his nose while reciting a poem. Some fools trained animals, monkeys, dogs, even pigs, and performed with them like medieval street magicians. A noble banquet might suddenly feature a pig dressed in a velvet cape, dancing clumsily while the court howled with laughter. And if you think that sounds absurd, it was. But that absurdity was the whole point, the painful side of comedy. Not all stunts were fun. Some were humiliating or outright painful. Fools might be forced to eat disgusting foods, like raw onions until they gagged, or bowls of gruel spiced so heavily it burned their mouths. Others performed slapstick violence, tumbling into barrels, getting smacked with sticks, staging clumsy fights with other servants. Imagine being ordered to get knocked flat on your back, not once, but over and over, while the court chuckled over their roast goose. That was entertainment. Sword swallowers and fire breathers. Some fools leaned into danger. Chroniclers describe performers swallowing swords, breathing fire with alcohol-soaked torches, and even biting the heads off chickens. It was shock value. Centuries before shock value became a modern entertainment strategy. People laughed not just at the absurdity, but at the sheer audacity, and maybe a little at the risk that the fool might choke, burn, or poison himself mid-show. Musical oddities. Minstrels also pulled weird tricks with instruments. Some were skilled enough to play two at once, like a flute and a drum, keeping rhythm with one hand and melody with the other. Others performed bawdy songs full of innuendo, turning music into a comic weapon. There are even accounts of musical duels, where two minstrels faced off, trading verses and insults until the crowd picked a winner. Think of it as the medieval version of a rap battle, but with lutes instead of microphones. Physical oddities and exploitation. Sadly, not all talents were chosen. Some fools were kept in court precisely because of physical deformities, disabilities, or conditions that nobles found amusing. Dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people with mental illness were sometimes exploited as living curiosities. In these cases, the performance was simply existing, being paraded around in silly costumes, mocked for traits they never asked for. It's one of the darker corners of court entertainment, reminding us how cruel laughter could be. Jokes with props fools also loved props. A bladder on a stick was a popular one. They'd bop people with it during performances. Wooden hobby horses, fake crowns, and oversized shoes were also common. These props weren't just goofy, they were symbolic, mocking nobility with fake crowns or parodying knights with hobby horses allowed fools to poke fun at authority while pretending it was just a joke. It was comedy as camouflage. Why they did it. All these bizarre tricks boil down to one thing: survival. If a king or lord got bored, a fool could lose more than his job. So they risked humiliation, pain, even their health to keep laughter flowing. In a way, their bodies were the real instruments. Every pratfall, every burn, every bite of disgusting food was an offering to the court's appetite for novelty. So, we've seen their strangest stunts. In Part 11, let's shift toward the end game, the decline of fools and minstrels, why they disappeared, and how their spirit lived on in theater, satire, and modern comedy. Every act has to end. For jesters and minstrels, the curtain didn't fall with a bang, but with a long, quiet fade out. By the 1600s, the world that needed them had changed. Why minstrels faded first. The earliest to vanish were the minstrels. For centuries, they were walking news channels, carrying gossip, stories, and ballads from town to town. But then along came the printing press. Once books, pamphlets, and broadsheets could spread stories faster and more reliably, the minstrel's role as a storyteller started to feel outdated. Why wait for a dusty traveler with a lute when you could read about battles, scandals, and poetry yourself? By the 15th and 16th centuries, many towns in England even passed laws banning wandering minstrels, lumping them in with beggars and vagrants. Their songs, once treasured, were now seen as noise. Some adapted, becoming theater musicians, court composers, or early opera performers. But the age of the free-roaming minstrel was gone. Jesters hanging on jesters, however, managed to survive a little longer, Kings and nobles still liked having that splash of color in their courts. A fool could still ease tension, distract from stress, and mock enemies without starting a war. But even they weren't safe from changing tastes. By the Renaissance, courts grew more formal. Nobles preferred pageants, masks, and professional theater. Comedy became scripted, entertainment became polished. The rough improvisational energy of the fool started to look undignified. By the 1700s, the court fool was basically extinct. From fool to wise fool. Yet the jester never really disappeared. Instead, he transformed. Writers like Shakespeare and Molière resurrected him on stage. The fool became a stock character, silly on the surface, wise underneath. Think of Shakespeare's King Lear, where the fool is the only one brave enough to tell Lear the truth. On paper, the fool lived longer than he ever did in palaces. Their echo in modern entertainment. Even today you can trace the fool's DNA everywhere. Stand-up comedians mocking politicians. Satirists poking fun at power in newspapers or on TV. Clowns making us laugh through pratfalls. Even political cartoonists who exaggerate rulers' flaws into ridiculous caricatures. The minstrel, too, survived in different forms. Folk singers, protest ballads, traveling buskers. Every time a songwriter tells a story or sways opinion with a lyric, they're carrying that medieval torch. Why they faded. So why did fools and minstrels vanish? Not because people stopped laughing or singing, but because society built new ways to laugh and sing. The printing press, the theater, the rise of journalism, the professionalization of music, all of it chipped away at the old roles. They weren't fired, they were replaced. A quiet exit. What's striking is how quietly they disappeared. No great rebellion of jesters, no final ballad of minstrels. They just slipped out of the spotlight. One day, they were necessary. The next, they were curiosities. And finally, they were memories, the lasting legacy. But their legacy lingers in surprising ways. Every time someone cracks a sarcastic joke at a politician, or sings a song about injustice, or makes people laugh to soften grief, that's the spirit of fools and minstrels at work. They may not wear bells or strum lutes anymore, but their echoes are still with us. So, that's the decline. In Part 12, we'll close the curtain with a reflective conclusion, asking why these strange, precarious performers still fascinate us today, and what they reveal about the human need for laughter and stories. So here we are, at the end of our long drift through medieval laughter and song. We've met the wandering minstrels, plucking their way from castle to tavern. We've seen jesters tumbling, juggling, and slyly speaking truths to kings who trusted no one else. We've watched them soar, stumble, and sometimes die for the sake of a joke. And the question left hanging in the candlelight is this: why do we still care? The human need for laughter. At the heart of it, fools and jesters remind us of something timeless. Human beings, whether peasants huddled in mud huts or kings weighed down by crowns, need to laugh. Laughter is a release valve, a medicine, a rebellion against despair. Minstrels and fools didn't invent humor, but they professionalized it. They made it their job to turn fear into giggles, to dress tragedy in motley, to translate power into parody. In a world that was brutal, unpredictable, and often short, they gave people one thing no sword or law could offer: relief, the fragility of their lives. But they also remind us how precarious survival was for those without power. A minstrel could be celebrated in one hall and chased from the next. A fool could be treasured one day and executed the next. They lived at the mercy of others, tolerated because they entertained, discarded when they didn't. Their laughter often hid desperation. Their songs often masked hunger. And maybe that's why they resonate, because beneath the motley and melody, they were simply humans trying to get by, their echo in us. Even though courts no longer keep fools, the archetype survives. The late-night comedian, the protest singer, the clown at the circus, the sarcastic voice in your own head that keeps you sane in hard times. Every joke against authority, every song that tells the truth better than a speech, every laugh in the dark, all of that is the inheritance of minstrels and jesters. They remind us that humor and storytelling aren't luxuries. They're survival skills. The last bow. So next time you laugh at a clever quip or hum along to a song that makes the world feel a little lighter, spare a thought for those strange figures of the past, for the fool who mocked death to save his life, for the minstrel who strummed stories into history, for the forgotten entertainers who juggled, sang, and stumbled across cold stone floors just to keep the fire of laughter alive. Because though they left the stage centuries ago, their spirit never really exited. And that's where we'll leave our story tonight. The minstrels have packed away their lutes, the fools have jingled off into the shadows, and the candles in the great hall are burning low. Thanks for drifting through history with me. And until next time, sleep well. Sweet dreams.